Has it ever happened to you that suddenly the conversation stops and the silence becomes unbearable? Why does the mind go blank in those seconds? Why do we feel that we are failing, that the other person is judging us, that we should say something right now? The biggest problem isn't the silence itself, but the fear we project onto it. And there is another, even more important detail that almost nobody notices. Stick around, because understanding this can forever change the way you talk to anyone. For a long time, every time I found myself in a conversation with someone I didn't know well, I felt the same discomfort. Everything was going more or less fine until suddenly that dreaded moment appeared. No one was saying anything. The silence fell like an invisible weight, and in a matter of seconds, my body reacted. My heart raced, my breathing became shallower, and my mind began to desperately search for something to say. This happened to me in very common situations. At a new job, talking with colleagues during a break, in a class sitting next to someone I didn't know, even in social encounters where, in theory, everything should be relaxed. As soon as the conversation stopped, my attention stopped being on the other person and focused entirely on myself. I thought about how I looked, how awkward I must seem, and the possibility that I was boring the other person. The curious thing is that in those moments, I wasn't really listening. I was trapped in my own head. Every second of silence seemed to confirm an idea that repeated itself over and over. Something was going wrong. I began to believe that silence was a sign of failure, proof that I didn't know how to communicate, that I wasn't interesting, or that I wasn't up to the task. Over time, this fear of silence became a kind of constant anticipation. Even before starting a conversation, I was already thinking about how to avoid those awkward moments. I prepared phrases in my head, looked for safe topics, and tried to keep the conversation moving at all costs. But the more I tried, the more tense the situation became. The anxiety didn't come from the silence itself, but from what I believed that silence meant. I believed that everyone noticed it, that everyone judged it, and that little void said something negative about me. It wasn't until I started to observe these situations more calmly that I realized something important. Most people were just as focused on their own thoughts as I was. And that discovery was the first step toward understanding the true nature of silence in a conversation. Over time, I started to look at those moments of silence from another perspective. I realized they weren't as dramatic as my mind made them seem. The truth is that most of the time, those seconds go unnoticed. The other person isn't analyzing every pause or drawing deep conclusions about your worth or your ability to communicate. In reality, they almost never remember those silences after the conversation ends. The problem is the story we tell ourselves. We interpret silence as a sign of failure, when in reality it is something completely normal. Conversations are not perfectly written scripts. They are living exchanges with rhythms, pauses, and changes of direction. Expecting them to flow without any empty space is an unrealistic expectation. I also understood something more important. Silence doesn't always mean there's nothing to say. Many times it's simply a moment of processing. The other person may be thinking, remembering something, or looking for the right way to express themselves. Interrupting that space out of fear only adds unnecessary pressure. Accepting the silence instead of running from it completely changes the dynamic. However, recognizing that silence is not dangerous doesn't automatically eliminate the discomfort. There are conversations that feel forced, dry, as if there were no real connection, and that is also part of the human experience. Not all interactions have to be deep or memorable. Some simply exist and then end, without any greater meaning. Here is the key point. The more you try to control the conversation, the more artificial it becomes. When you are obsessed with saying something, you stop listening. And when you stop listening, you lose the natural opportunities that the other person offers you to continue the dialogue. Silence, instead of being an obstacle, can become a signal, an invitation to pay attention, to observe details, and to connect more genuinely. Accepting this reality was liberating. It allowed me to relax and stop fighting against every pause. But accepting silence doesn't mean staying still. It means learning to use it. And for that, there is a fundamental first habit that completely transforms any conversation: truly listening. Truly listening is a much more powerful skill than it seems. Most people hear words, but they don't pay attention to the meaning behind them. While the other person is talking, they are already thinking about what to say next, how to look good, or how to avoid the next silence. Active listening changes that dynamic completely. It consists of being present without rushing, without preparing responses in advance. When you listen attentively, you start to notice details that previously went unnoticed. A specific word, an emotion, a pause, a gesture. Every sentence someone says contains open-ended information, something that isn't completely closed off. That is where the conversation is born. You don't need a brilliant topic or a spectacular question. You just need genuine curiosity about what the other person is sharing. Imagine someone mentions that they had to take their car to the shop. Most would respond with a generic comment or change the subject quickly. But if you listen actively, you can go deeper. You can ask what happened to the car, if it was something unexpected, how long they were without it, or how they felt when it happened. You aren't interrogating, you are showing real interest, and that interest is felt. Another simple example, someone says they hurt their hand. You can let the comment pass or you can stop there. How did it happen? Was it serious? Did it hurt a lot? Each of those questions comes from attention, not from a pre-established script. The conversation flows because you follow the natural thread of what the other is already saying. The key is not to rush. The silence that appears after a sentence doesn't always need to be filled immediately. Sometimes, that space allows the other person to expand on the idea themselves. When you don't interrupt, when you don't feel the urgency to speak, the other person usually continues, and they do so with more depth. Active listening also changes the perception others have of you. People feel valued when they realize you are really paying attention. Not because you ask smart questions, but because you aren't distracted. Because you remember what they said before. Because you connect one idea with another. That feeling of being heard creates trust and comfort. Furthermore, listening reduces internal pressure. When you focus on the other, you stop observing yourself all the time. Anxiety decreases because you are no longer evaluating every word that comes out of your mouth. You are reacting naturally to what's happening in front of you. The conversation stops being a test and becomes an exchange. This habit isn't learned overnight, but it is strengthened with conscious practice. Every conversation is an opportunity to practice it. And the more you do it, the less you worry about running out of things to say. Because when you truly listen, there is always something to explore. Active listening is the first pillar, but it's not the only one. For a conversation to have depth and continuity, you also need something more than attention. You need internal content, experiences, and references to feed that exchange. And that's where the second fundamental habit comes in. Many people believe their problem is not knowing what to say, but in reality, the problem is usually something else. They have nowhere to draw content from. A conversation isn't sustained by techniques alone. It's sustained by life, by experiences, by real interests. When you don't do anything that excites you, when you don't explore anything new, the dialogue becomes limited, not for lack of skill, but for lack of material. Building conversation fuel means living more consciously. It means allowing yourself to develop interests, even if they seem simple or unimpressive. You don't need to be an expert or have extraordinary stories. It's enough to have curiosity about something. A sport, a type of music, walking long distances, learning about psychology, fixing things on your own. All of that becomes raw material for connecting with others. When you have genuine interests, the pressure to say something disappears. You aren't looking for random topics, you are sharing parts of your world, and that feels much more natural. In addition, interests function as meeting points. When you discover that someone shares a hobby with you, the conversation flows effortlessly. Not because you are both great communicators, but because there is common ground. Another important aspect is that your interests evolve over time. It's not about accumulating topics to impress others, but about allowing yourself to change, try new things and learn. Every experience, even the small ones, adds layers to the way you communicate. A long walk can lead to reflections. A book can spark questions. A previous conversation can give you new perspectives. It's also key to understand that not everything you share has to be brilliant. Sometimes talking about something every day is enough to create a connection. The important thing is authenticity. When you talk about something that really matters to you, your tone changes, your body language relaxes, and the other person senses it. The conversation stops being a mental effort and becomes a natural expression. This habit also reduces the fear of judgment. When you build your own internal world, you stop depending so much on external approval. You no longer need to act to fit in. You are simply you, sharing what is part of your life. And that, paradoxically, makes you much more engaging. Over time, this internal fuel accumulates. You don't realize it immediately, but one day you notice that conversations last longer, that pauses no longer make you uncomfortable, and that you even enjoy those moments of exchange. Because now you aren't empty inside. You have something to offer, not to impress, but to connect. But there still remains one final obstacle that many people don't dare to face. Even with attention and content, there is still the fear of asking the wrong question. That silent fear that halts many conversations before they even start. And to overcome it, you need a third essential habit. There is a moment in many conversations when a silent doubt arises. What if the question I'm about to ask is stupid? That fear is one of the biggest roadblocks to communication. Not because the question is actually bad, but because we fear how we might be perceived. We think that asking something obvious, simple, or unpolished will make us seem uninteresting or unintelligent. The reality is very different. Most conversations die out not because of bad questions, but because of an absence of questions. When no one dares to go deeper, the dialogue stays on the surface and slowly fades away. So-called stupid questions are usually, in fact, honest questions. They are born of curiosity, not a desire to impress. And people feel that. When you ask something simple, you give the other person space to talk. People like to explain, tell stories, and share their point of view. Even a basic question can open the door to an interesting conversation if it's asked with genuine attention. It's not about formulating something brilliant. It's about showing real interest in what the other person is experiencing or thinking. Often the questions that seem most obvious are the ones no one dares to ask. And that's exactly why they work. They break the tension, humanize the conversation, and create closeness. There is nothing more natural than admitting you don't know something and wanting to understand it better. That vulnerability creates connection. It's also important to accept that not every question will yield a great answer. And that's okay. A conversation is not an interview or a test. It's an exchange. Some questions open paths, others don't. The important thing is not to block yourself for fear of failing. Every attempt reduces the pressure and builds confidence. Over time, this habit changes your relationship with silence. You no longer see it as a threat, but as an opportunity, a space where a question can arise, however simple it may be. And when you allow yourself to ask it without judging yourself, the conversation moves again. This third habit completes the set. Truly listening, having internal fuel, and daring to ask without fear. These aren't complicated techniques or magic formulas. They are attitudes, ways of being present in a conversation. And when these attitudes are integrated, silence stops being an enemy. Now then, even applying all this, there is a final truth that is worth accepting. Not all conversations are destined to work. And understanding that is what really sets you free. After understanding all this, a truth emerges that many people avoid accepting. Not all conversations are going to work, and not all of them should. Sometimes a silence doesn't happen because you did something wrong, but because there simply isn't mutual interest. The other person might be tired, distracted, or just not in the mood to talk, and that says nothing negative about you. Trying to force a conversation when there is no response is like trying to water a dead plant. No matter how much water you use, it's not going to grow. Learning to recognize this is a form of social maturity. You don't need to convince anyone to talk to you. You don't need to prove your worth through every interaction. Some conversations flow, others don't, and both are normal. Accepting this reality removes a huge amount of pressure. You stop carrying the responsibility of making everything work. You allow yourself to be present, to listen, to ask and to share, without the need to control the outcome. When a conversation ends in silence, you no longer interpret it as a personal failure, but as the natural end of an exchange. Curiously, this acceptance usually improves your conversations. When you aren't desperate to keep them alive, you relax. Your tone changes, your body language softens, and your presence becomes more comfortable for others. People can sense when there is no pressure, when there is no tension, and that often invites a more genuine connection. Silence then stops being an enemy. It becomes a signal. Sometimes it indicates it's time to listen more. Other times, it's time to ask a simple question. And sometimes it's time to let the conversation go without guilt. Knowing how to tell these situations apart is what really makes the difference. In the end, it was never about always having something to say. It was about changing your relationship with silence, with attention, and with yourself. When you stop fighting against those awkward moments, you discover that conversations don't need to be perfect to be human. Every exchange is an opportunity, not a test. And the more you understand that, the freer you feel when talking to anyone, anywhere, because you no longer depend on filling every space with words. You know that sometimes true control is in allowing the silence to exist.